The knock came just as I was stepping out of the shower. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock that carried weight. I grabbed a towel and wrapped it around my waist, the sound of the knock still echoing in my ears as I padded down the hallway. Through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize. Early 30s, well-dressed, with an expression that teetered between regret and determination. Something about him set my nerves on edge. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep the annoyance out of my voice. His shoulders sagged slightly, like he'd expected hostility. "I need to talk to you about Eleanor," he said, glancing at the doorframe instead of meeting my eyes. At first, the name didn't register. Eleanor was just Ellie to me, my wife of 9 years, my partner through thick and thin. But hearing her full name, spoken by a stranger, sent a chill down my spine. "What about her?" I asked, my grip tightening on the door. He hesitated, then said something that made my blood run cold. "I think she's been lying to both of us." I didn't invite him in right away. I stood there, my heart pounding, staring at this man who claimed to know something about my wife. He introduced himself as Chris and said he'd been seeing Ellie for months, but he hadn't known she was married. It was only after finding her wedding ring tucked away in her purse that he'd started asking questions. "That ring," he said, "led him here." I couldn't process it. Ellie? Cheating? It felt absurd, impossible. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Weren't we? Chris pulled out his phone and showed me the evidence. Photos of Ellie, dressed to the nines, laughing over drinks. A series of text messages filled with innuendos and promises. The last one hit me like a freight train. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I need to feel alive again." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as a sick, hollow feeling settled in my chest. Chris said he was sorry. He hadn't known. He just thought I deserved to know the truth. I slammed the door in his face. I stood there for a long time, leaning against the door, my breathing ragged. The house was quiet, painfully so. Ellie wasn't home. She told me she had a late meeting with a client, some kind of networking event she couldn't miss. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the images on Chris's phone burned in my mind, erasing every shred of doubt I might have clung to. I grabbed my phone and opened our shared calendar. The networking event wasn't listed. That wasn't unusual. Ellie was spontaneous, always juggling last-minute plans. But tonight, that omission felt like confirmation. I tossed the phone onto the couch and sat down heavily, my head in my hands. If what Chris said was true, everything I thought I knew about Ellie, about our marriage, was a lie. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. If she thought she could play me, she was wrong. Because while she was out there, living her double life, I was already planning how to unravel it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every sound in the house amplified by my racing thoughts. Ellie didn't come home until after midnight. She slipped into bed quietly, her scent a mix of perfume and alcohol. I kept my eyes closed, breathing evenly, pretending to be asleep. She didn't touch me, didn't say a word, just rolled onto her side and drifted off as if nothing had happened. By morning, I had a plan. Ellie was out of the house early, claiming she had to prep for a big client pitch. I watched her go, the hollow feeling in my chest tightening as she waved at me from the driveway. Once she was gone, I started digging. Her laptop was password protected, but that didn't matter. Ellie had a habit of leaving sticky notes with reminders on her desk, and one of them had her password scrawled across it. I logged in and began sifting through her emails, her messages, her calendar. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were emails from someone named Christopher. I realized it was the same Chris who'd shown up at my door. Their messages were carefully worded, almost professional, but the attachments told a different story. Photos of them together, text conversations laced with coded affection, and receipts from hotel bookings she hadn't mentioned to me. But there was more. Another name, another string of messages. Another man. This one wasn't Chris. His name was Andrew, and the tone of their exchanges was different, more intense, more intimate. My stomach churned as I pieced together the timeline. Ellie hadn't just been seeing Chris. She'd been juggling 2 affairs at once, weaving her lies so tightly that I'd never noticed. Until now. I closed the laptop and sat back, my hands shaking. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined, not just because of what she'd done, but because of the lengths she'd gone to hide it. I thought about confronting her, demanding answers, forcing her to explain how she could betray me so completely. But as the anger simmered, another thought took hold. What if I didn't confront her? What if, instead of tipping her off, I let her think she'd gotten away with it? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through our shared finances, noting every suspicious charge. Fancy dinners I hadn't attended, unexplained withdrawals, and travel expenses that didn't line up with her supposed work trips. I made copies of everything, building a file that was as damning as it was thorough. Every detail was a thread, and I was weaving them together into a net she wouldn't see until it was too late. That evening, Ellie came home with a bright smile and a takeout bag. She kissed me on the cheek, her charm disarming as ever, and acted as if nothing was wrong. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light, almost playful. "Good," I said, keeping my tone even. "Busy, but good." She didn't notice the tension in my voice. Or if she did, she ignored it. As we sat down to eat, she talked about her client meeting, describing the details with such ease that I almost believed her. Almost. But as she laughed and poured herself a glass of wine, all I could think about was the file hidden in my office drawer. The file that held the truth she was so carefully trying to hide. I smiled at her, pretending to hang on her every word. She had no idea what was coming. Ellie's laughter echoed through the house as she recounted some story about a difficult client at work. I nodded in all the right places, even managed a chuckle or two, but my mind was far from the table. She was so casual, so convincing, the way she spun her lies, painting herself as the overworked but dedicated professional. It was a masterclass in deception. But I knew better now. I had the file, I had the proof, and I had a plan. The next day, while Ellie was at work, or wherever she went when she claimed to be working, I started laying the groundwork. First, I installed a GPS tracker under her car. It was small, discreet, and synced to my phone. If she wasn't where she claimed to be, I'd know. Next, I set up a hidden camera in the living room. It was positioned to capture the entryway and the couch, her favorite spot to make her late-night calls when she thought I was asleep. Finally, I bought a second phone, a burner, something she wouldn't recognize. I programmed it with a private email account and a few apps I'd need to monitor her activities without raising suspicion. By the time she came home that evening, everything was in place. Ellie's mood had shifted. She was distant, distracted. She barely looked at me as she kicked off her heels and poured herself a drink. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded, her smile tight. "Exhausting." Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, her expression flickering with something I couldn't quite place before she picked it up and walked into the other room. I waited a few minutes before checking the live feed from the hidden camera. There she was, curled up on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was soft, intimate, the kind of tone she hadn't used with me in months. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I didn't need to. Her body language told me everything. The tracker pinged the next morning. Ellie had told me she was meeting a colleague for coffee before heading into the office, but her car was parked outside a boutique hotel downtown. I clenched my jaw, staring at the map on my phone. This was the third time that week. The camera in the living room had captured her leaving the house, dressed in a way she rarely bothered to for me anymore. Heels, a fitted dress, her hair and makeup flawless. I opened the burner phone and sent a message to the investigator I'd hired a few days earlier. "She's there. Room 412. His response came minutes later. On it, by the time Ellie came home that evening, I had the photos. Her and Elle, walking hand in hand into the hotel. Her smiling up at him as he opened the door. Her body language completely relaxed, completely at ease. She breezed through the door, tossing her purse onto the counter and greeting me with a kiss on the cheek. I smiled back, my stomach churning. "How was your meeting?" I asked. She laughed, shrugging. "Boring, but productive." I watched her as she poured herself a drink, her movements so natural, so effortless. She had no idea I was already 10 steps ahead. By now, Ellie's lies felt like clockwork, predictable, almost routine. She had no idea I was watching her every move, that the walls of her carefully constructed world were starting to close in. The photos from the investigator sat in a folder on my desk, along with the screenshots of her messages, the tracker logs, and the recordings from the hidden camera. Together, they formed an airtight narrative, a timeline of her betrayal. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Confronting her now would give her the upper hand. She'd spin it, blame me, and turn it into a fight about my lack of trust or paranoia. No, I needed to dismantle her life piece by piece, quietly, methodically. The first crack came in the form of her job. Ellie worked as a regional account manager for a luxury home decor company. She was good at what she did, and her charm made her a favorite with clients. But I knew her employer had a strict code of conduct, one that didn't look kindly on workplace relationships, especially with clients or coworkers. Using the burner phone, I sent an anonymous email to her boss. The subject line was simple: concern regarding Eleanor Walker's conduct. Attached were a few choice photos of her and Elle, their faces unmistakable, along with a short message. I thought you should know that Eleanor has been meeting a co-worker outside of work hours at hotels. This may be impacting her professionalism. I didn't sign the email. I didn't need to. The second crack came at home. Ellie loved control, loved being the one who managed the details of our life. Dinner plans, holidays, social events. But I started to undermine her, subtly at first. I canceled a dinner reservation she'd made, claiming it was an accident. I forgot to pick up groceries she needed for a party. Each time, she got more irritated, her frustration simmering just below the surface. "Why are you being so careless lately?" she snapped one evening as she tried to salvage a ruined dinner plan. I shrugged, feigning indifference. Guess I've just been distracted. Her glare could have burned a hole through me. The third crack was the hardest to execute, but the most satisfying. Ellie had a small circle of close friends, women she'd known for years. They were loyal to her, always taking her side in any argument. But I knew something they didn't. Ellie thrived on their admiration, their belief that she had the perfect marriage, the perfect life. So I decided to shatter that illusion. Using the burner phone again, I sent a message to one of her friends, Jenna. "Hey Jenna, I thought you should know something about Ellie. Check the attached photo." The photo was one of her and Elle, sitting too close at a hotel bar. Just ambiguous enough to make Jenna ask questions. Jenna replied almost immediately. "Who is this? Is this real?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The fallout started slowly. Ellie came home one evening, her face pale, her movements tense. She didn't say much during dinner, barely touched her food. When I asked if everything was okay, she shook her head, her jaw tight. "Work's been stressful," she muttered. I almost laughed. A few days later, one of her friends called while she was in the shower. I picked up, recognizing the name on the caller ID. "Hi, Jenna," I said, keeping my tone light. There was a long pause on the other end before she spoke. "Is everything okay with you and Ellie?" The hesitation in her voice told me she already knew something was wrong. "Why do you ask?" I said, dodging the question. She sighed. "I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but I think you should talk to her." I thanked her and hung up, a small smile playing on my lips. The cracks were spreading. That evening, Ellie was quieter than usual. She poured herself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at her phone. "Is everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She looked up at me, her expression guarded. "Yeah," she said quickly, too quickly. She was lying again, and she had no idea the game had only just begun. The cracks in Ellie's life were growing wider, but she was still holding on, trying to maintain the illusion of control. Her smiles were forced now, her laughter brittle. I could see the tension in her every move, the weight of secrets pressing down on her. But she hadn't broken yet. That was fine. I had plenty of time. Her job was the first domino to fall. A week after I sent the email to her boss, Ellie came home in a foul mood. She dropped her bag by the door and poured herself a double of bourbon, something she only did when things were spiraling. "Rough day?" I asked, feigning concern. She sighed heavily, slumping onto the couch. "Corporate's doing an audit," she said, rubbing her temples. "Something about employee conduct. They're interviewing everyone next week." I nodded, hiding my satisfaction. "I'm sure it'll blow over," I said. "You've always been their golden girl." She shot me a look, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge whether I was mocking her. I kept my expression neutral. Her friends were next. Jenna's suspicion had spread like wildfire. Ellie's group of confidants was tight-knit, but loyalty only went so far when trust was fractured. The photos I'd sent were enough to sow doubt, and doubt was all I needed. Ellie started getting fewer invites, fewer calls. When she did talk to her friends, her voice was clipped, defensive. "People are acting weird," she said one night, nursing another bourbon. "Jenna's been distant. Even Sarah's giving me attitude." "Maybe they're just busy," I offered, my tone innocent. She shook her head, her jaw tight. "No, it's something else. I don't know what, but—" She trailed off, her fingers tightening around the glass. I didn't press. I didn't need to. The final domino came in the form of Elle. I'd been waiting for the right moment to turn their affair into a liability for him. He was a married man, too, and his wife deserved to know the truth. One evening, while Ellie was out, I found her phone on the counter. She'd left it unlocked, a careless mistake she rarely made these days. It only took a few minutes to find what I was looking for, a series of texts between her and Elle, explicit and incriminating. I took screenshots and emailed them to myself before carefully placing her phone back where I'd found it. The next morning, I sent the screenshots to his wife. The response was immediate. "Who is this?" she wrote back. "How do you know my husband?" "Just someone who thought you deserved to know," I replied. I didn't hear back from her, but later that week, Ellie came home with a look I'd never seen before: panic. "Something's happened," she said, pacing the kitchen. "Elle's wife found out about us. She's threatening to blow everything up." I leaned against the counter, my expression carefully blank. "What are you going to do?" She shook her head, her hands trembling. "I don't know. He says we need to lay low for a while. Let things cool off." I nodded, hiding the satisfaction that threatened to creep into my voice. "Sounds like a good idea," I said. Ellie's carefully curated life was unraveling faster than she could patch it together. Her job, her friends, her lover, all slipping through her fingers. She didn't know it yet, but the final act was already in motion. And when it hit, it would leave nothing standing. Ellie's facade was crumbling. She moved through the house like a ghost, her usual self-assured demeanor replaced with something jagged and brittle. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched. She barely spoke to me anymore, her eyes darting away whenever I caught her looking at me. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how wrong. And I wasn't about to give her time to figure it out. The fallout with Elle was messier than I'd anticipated. His wife had filed for divorce, and word had spread quickly through Ellie's office. Their audit had shifted focus, with several colleagues pulled in for interviews about her conduct. She came home one evening, her face pale, her hands shaking as she poured herself another drink. "They're investigating me," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone reported something. I don't even know what, but they're looking into my emails, my accounts. Everything." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "Do you think they'll find anything?" Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. For a moment, I thought she might say something, an accusation, maybe, or a plea for reassurance. But she just shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. "No," she said quietly. "There's nothing to find." Another lie. Her social life had all but disintegrated. Jenna and Sarah were no longer answering her calls, and even casual acquaintances seemed to be keeping their distance. One evening, while she was in the shower, I used to burn her phone to send another message, this time to the group chat she shared with her friends. "Thought you should all know what Ellie's been up to. She's not who you think she is." I attached one of the photos from the hotel, her arm linked with Elle's, their smiles too intimate to misinterpret. When she came out of the bathroom, her phone was buzzing incessantly. She picked it up, her face draining of color as she read the messages pouring in. "Ellie, what the hell is this? Is this true? How could you? I can't believe you'd do something like this." She sank onto the bed, her hands trembling as she typed out responses, her words frantic and defensive. I watched from the doorway, my arms crossed. "Everything okay?" She looked up at me, her eyes red, her expression panicked. "Someone's sending things to my friends. Photos. Lies." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Lies? Or the truth? Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The next morning, She called in sick to work. She stayed in bed most of the day, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. I gave her space, letting the weight of her choices settle in. But that evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her drink, I decided it was time for the next move. "I've been thinking," I said, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her expression wary. "Maybe we should take some time apart," I said. "Things have been tense lately. I think it might be good for both of us." Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "You're leaving me?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but I think we need to figure out what we want. Separately." She didn't respond, her gaze dropping to the table. "I'll be staying with a friend for a while," I added, pushing the lie as smoothly as she'd pushed hers. "You'll have the house to yourself. Time to think." She nodded slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Okay," she whispered. But as I packed my bag that night, I saw the doubt in her eyes, the suspicion she couldn't quite voice. She had no idea the trap was already closing. The house felt eerie as I packed my bag, Ellie watching me from the kitchen table. She was trying to act composed, but her hands gave her away, fidgeting with the edge of her drink, fingers tapping against the wood in uneven rhythms. She didn't fight me on my decision to leave for a while. I knew she wanted to, but she was too drained, too cornered. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, and I was pulling out the final supports. When I stepped out the door, I could feel her watching me. I didn't look back. I didn't go far. The bag I packed was more theater than necessity, filled with random clothes and toiletries I didn't need. My real destination was a small Airbnb a few miles away. From there, I could watch everything unfold. The tracker under Ellie's car was still active, and the hidden cameras in the house fed directly to my laptop. I could see her, hear her, track her every move, all without stepping foot inside the house. Ellie spent the first night in a haze. She paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, scrolling through messages that weren't coming. Her circle of friends had gone quiet. The second night, she called her sister. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Ellie's voice carried a mix of anger and desperation. She kept saying it wasn't true, that people were out to get her, that everything was being blown out of proportion. The sister wasn't convinced. Her job came next. On the third day, I watched as she sat on the couch, staring at her laptop, tears streaming down her face. A long email from HR had come through, the subject line cold and formal. Conclusion of internal investigation. I hacked in her laptop's email client days before. The message was clear. The company had found evidence of conduct unbecoming of an employee in her position and decided to terminate her employment effective immediately. She sobbed, her face buried in her hands. I didn't feel sympathy. This was what she'd built for herself, brick by deceitful brick. But the most satisfying blow came from Elle. On the fourth night, her car tracker pinged. She wasn't headed to a grocery store or a cafe. She was driving toward the boutique hotel, their usual meeting spot. I waited, watching the GPS. But she didn't stay long. 10 minutes later, her car was moving again, this time at a faster pace. The camera in the living room caught her storming into the house, her face red with rage. She threw her purse onto the floor and kicked off her shoes with more force than necessary. I listened as she made a call. "You're ending things now? After everything?" Her voice was sharp, shaking. "You're such a coward, you know that?" I didn't need to hear the other side to understand what was happening. Elle was cutting ties, distancing himself now that his life had been upended. Ellie's anger dissolved into sobs, her words dissolving into incoherent pleas. But he hung up. For the next few days, she barely left the house. She sat in the same spot on the couch, staring blankly at the walls, her phone silent and her email inbox empty. I let her stew in it, the weight of her choices finally catching up to her. But the final act was still to come. I had one more card to play, and when I did, it would leave her with nothing. By the sixth day, Ellie was a shell of herself. The woman who once thrived on control, charm, and deceit was now crumbling under the weight of her own lies. She barely moved from the couch, her eyes glazed over as she scrolled aimlessly through her phone. She didn't know it yet, but I had saved the most devastating move for last. That evening, I drafted an email. The recipient, Ava and Lucas, our 2 adult children. Subject line, the truth about your mother. The body of the email was simple, factual. No embellishments, no anger, just the unvarnished truth. Attached were copies of the photos, the messages, and the timeline I'd meticulously compiled. I hesitated before hitting send. This was the hardest part of my plan. Not because I doubted Ellie deserved it. She did, but because of what it would mean for Ava and Lucas. They deserved to know. They deserved the truth. I hit send. Ellie's phone buzzed just as I finished. I watched through the camera feed as she picked it up, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. She stood abruptly, pacing the living room as she dialed Ava. Ava, I can explain, she said, her voice shaking. It's not what it looks like. Your father is twisting things. I could only imagine what Ava was saying on the other end. Ellie's face fell, her eyes wide with panic. No, listen to me. I made mistakes, but he's making it seem worse than it is. Please, don't let this come between us. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Ava hung up, and Ellie's hand dropped to her side, the phone dangling limply. She didn't even try calling Lucas. I returned to the house the next morning, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes bloodshot, her face gaunt. You told them, she said, her voice hollow. I nodded. They deserved to know. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. You've destroyed me, Floyd. No, I said, my voice calm. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure the truth came out. She tried to argue, to shift the blame onto me one last time. She claimed I'd been distant, that I hadn't noticed her needs, that her choices were somehow a reaction to my failures. But I didn't let her rewrite the narrative. You had a choice, Ellie, I said, my voice firm. You could have come to me, talked to me, worked through whatever you were feeling. But instead, you lied. You cheated. And now you're facing the consequences. She didn't respond. She just stared at me, defeated. That afternoon, I gave her an ultimatum. I'm filing for divorce, I said, sliding a stack of papers across the table. You can fight me on it, or you can sign these and make it easier on both of us. Either way, this ends now. She didn't even look at the papers. She just nodded, her head bowed. Over the next few days, she packed her things and moved out. I didn't ask where she was going, and she didn't offer. The house was quiet again, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a fresh start. Ellie's life continued to unravel after she left. Word of her affair had spread through her social circles, leaving her isolated. The termination from her job made it difficult for her to find work in her field. But I didn't check in on her. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, I was focused on myself. The house was mine again, but it felt different now. Quieter, lighter. The tension that had lived in every corner was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Freedom. I spent the first few days alone, sorting through the remnants of a life I no longer recognized. Ellie had left behind more than her clothes and books. She'd left traces of our past everywhere. Photos from happier times, notes she'd written me during the early years, small tokens of a life I thought was unshakable. I packed them all away, not out of anger, but because I needed a clean slate. Ava called me a week after Ellie moved out. She didn't sound angry anymore, just tired. Dad, I'm sorry for how I reacted, she said. This has been a lot. I know, I replied, keeping my voice calm. It's been a lot for all of us. There was a pause before she continued. I talked to Mom. She's not doing well. It didn't surprise me. Ellie had always been someone who thrived on control, on maintaining an image. Now that her lies were exposed, she had nothing to hide behind. I don't know if I should reach out to her, Ava said hesitantly. That's your choice, I said. But don't let her manipulate you. You deserve to set boundaries, Ava. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. The next few weeks were a blur of small, necessary changes. I started cooking for myself again, experimenting with recipes I'd never had the patience for before. I joined a local running group, something I'd always wanted to do but had put off for years. Each step felt like reclaiming a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, Lucas stopped by. He didn't say much at first, just sat beside me and stared out at the yard. "You're doing okay?" he finally asked. I nodded. Better than I thought I would. He didn't respond right away. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I still don't get why she did it." I looked at him, seeing the confusion and hurt in his expression. "Sometimes people make choices that have nothing to do with us," I said. "Your mom, she let something inside her grow until it took over. It wasn't about me, or you, or Ava. It was about her." Lucas nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's just hard to wrap my head around. You didn't deserve this, Dad." "I know," I said simply. "But we can't control what others do. We can only control how we respond." Ellie tried to reach out a few times after the divorce was finalized. Emails, voicemails, even a letter. Each one was filled with apologies, excuses, pleas for understanding. I didn't respond. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about moving forward. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The house felt like mine again, a place of peace rather than a battlefield. One Saturday morning, as I was finishing a run, I bumped into a woman from the group I joined. Her name was Claire, and she had an easy laugh and a kind smile. We started talking first about running, then about life. Over time, those conversations turned into coffee, then dinner, then something more. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not the man Ellie had shaped, not the man defined by her betrayal, but someone stronger, someone whole. The past was behind me, and for the first time, the future felt like mine to shape. Claire and I took things slowly. After everything that had happened, I wasn't ready to rush into anything, and she seemed to understand that. We met for runs, had long conversations over coffee, and occasionally cooked dinner together. She didn't pry into my past, and I didn't feel the need to explain, at least not right away. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she asked me about the house. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "But it feels heavy, almost like it's holding on to something." Her words struck a chord. The house was mine now, but it was still filled with echoes of a life I no longer lived. No matter how much I tried to make it my own, Ellie's presence lingered in the walls, in the furniture, in every corner. "I've been thinking about selling it," I admitted. Claire nodded, her gaze steady. "Maybe it's time." The decision to sell the house wasn't easy, but it felt right. It wasn't just about letting go of Ellie. It was about letting go of the version of myself that had clung to a broken dream for far too long. Over the next few weeks, I worked with a realtor to prepare the house for the market. I sorted through the last of the belongings Ellie had left behind, boxing up the memories I couldn't bring myself to throw away. One afternoon, as I was clearing out the attic, I found an old photo album tucked away in a dusty corner. It was filled with pictures of happier times, vacations, birthdays, quiet moments that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt like relics of another life. I flipped through the pages slowly, feeling a mix of nostalgia and grief. By the time I reached the end, though, something had shifted. These memories weren't about Ellie anymore. They were about me, about the life I'd lived and the person I'd been. And I was ready to move on. The house sold faster than I expected. Within a month, I'd packed up my things and handed over the keys to a young couple excited to make the space their own. I found a small place downtown, closer to work and the running trails I'd grown to love. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, a fresh start in every sense of the word. Claire and I continued to grow closer, and eventually I opened up to her about everything. The betrayal, the divorce, the revenge. Her reaction surprised me. "You're stronger than you think," she said, taking my hand. "What you went through would have broken a lot of people, but you didn't let it. You rebuilt." Her words stayed with me. One evening, as we sat on the couch in my new apartment, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you think you'll ever hear from her again?" she asked. I shrugged. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter. That chapter's closed." She smiled, her hands slipping into mine. "Good, because you deserve better." For the first time, I believed her. The revenge wasn't about destroying Ellie. It was about freeing myself. And now, as I stood on the balcony of my new home, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. This was my life now, and it was finally mine. What are your thoughts on my story? Let me know in the comments what you think about my choice and how you might have dealt with it.